That's super useful for setting the scene, Sig, and you just outlined the dual track approach. Let's come to those hinge points for a moment. Moments at which you argue Washington could have led the DPRK down the diplomatic path at a manageable level of risk. Can you take us through one of those hinge points that you analyze in the book and really sort of take us through your analysis of how a more sound, technically informed risk-benefit analysis could have led to different US policy at the time and hence potentially to a different outcome?
Well, that's a very good question. And you got right to the gist of what I try to show in the book, is that in the end, the US did not make technically informed risk management decisions at these hinge points particularly. So the first really big hinge point was actually back in October of 2002. And I'll just have to back up a little bit, to say that in Kim Il-sung, as I mentioned, where he looked for strategic accommodation to the United States, he actually walked down the path of getting to a nuclear deal. He died just before that was consummated in 1994. So his son, Kim Jong-il, took that over. And he did make the deal with the United States that was called the Agreed Framework during the Clinton administration. So that then went along, and it had its ups and downs during that time frame. But for the most part, what's important, by late 2000, sort of the end of the Clinton administration, the North Koreans and the United States were so close to that strategic accommodation. That is, you may remember that there was a visit of the highest ranking military person, Marshal Cho, to the White House in the United States, just amazing. And then Madeleine Albright, a little later in October this was actually 2000, went to North Korea. And so they were so close, but then, however, the Bush administration came in, and key individuals in the Bush administration, including Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld, and in the State Department, John Bolton, were adamantly set against doing any deal with the North Koreans. So then a couple of years, not quite a couple of years into the Bush administration, John Bolton was determined to kill that agreed framework. And indeed, what happened, he was given some ammunition, because what the North Koreans did during the agreed framework, they had agreed to freeze their plutonium program, the reactor and the reprocessing of plutonium, in return for the United States, along with Japan and South Korea, who would bear most of the costs of this, building them two big modern light water reactors. So that was in essence the deal. However, at the same time, as I'd indicated, the North Koreans always sort of kept the hedge. And so in the late 1990s, they resumed a uranium centrifuge program. Okay, well, the Clinton administration knew that, but there were additional evidence came up during early part in the Bush administration. And as John Bolton has said in one of his books, that was the hammer we needed to shatter the agreed framework. So in other words, he was determined to end that agreed framework. And so after a visit of Assistant Secretary James Kelly to Pyongyang in October of 2002, in essence, the Americans killed the agreed framework. They walked away from that. Okay, the hinge point nature, and exactly to answer your question, was such that at that particular time, the plutonium program was frozen. Okay, so the reactor was shut down. The spent fuel that had been sitting in the reactor had now been sitting in a spent fuel pool for 8 years, but it contained about 25 to 30 kilograms of plutonium. In other words, enough for 5 or 6 bombs. And it was there for the taking. And so when the Americans then said, you cheated on us, you developed, the uranium, you're developing the uranium path to the bomb, they walked away. So the reason it was a hinge point, and the reason it was not technically well informed, because when they walked away, it allowed the North Koreans in 6 months' time to reprocess that spent fuel, extract the plutonium, and in most likelihood, less than a year to build the bomb. And my estimate is they didn't have the bomb before. So that was the risk that they took. And the uranium enrichment program that they were so concerned about was in its infancy. And I show in the book, yes, indeed, they had a uranium enrichment. It was in its infancy, and it would have taken 10 years or more to bring that to fruition. So they traded one risk that only took them 6 months to a year to get to the bomb, for one that would have taken a decade or more. That's a poor, technically risk management informed decision. And then that indeed started the North Koreans, really directly towards the bomb. And eventually, after another hinge point, North Koreans then did the first nuclear test. So I think that was sort of the big one initially, because had the Americans stuck with that agreed framework, had they been willing to say, hey, look, this uranium enrichment, you guys should not be doing this, and let's figure out a way that you're going to shut this down. Had they been willing to do that, had they built the light water reactors and lit up North Korea, which for the most part had difficulties with electricity, that would have been very difficult for the North Koreans to walk back from. So they weren't willing to take the additional risk and walk down the path that could have led to North Korea never having nuclear weapons. We don't know, of course, if it would have gone that way, but the opportunity was passed up.